Hello friends! After much pre-flight drama, we finally got to go to New Zealand. A 4-hour international flight on what was frankly a tiny plane. I have forgotten how cramped aeroplanes are, and we had to wear a mask the entire way. What fun! But we made it to Auckland, so it was totally worth it. The sun eventually came out and we were able to get some wonderful views of Auckland Harbour. Harbour cities are always so picturesque, aren't they? Out in the harbour is the dormant volcano Rangitoto, and I have climbed this a few times in my life, and I always have a feeling of coming home when I see it. The wind had picked up, but I managed to get a little painting of it in my sketchbook. I did not do a lot of plein air sketching while we were away, but this was one of them. I mean, how could I not paint it? While in Auckland, we spent a lovely day with my uncle and aunt, and then we packed up our rental car, a Kia Stonic, to head on down to Tauranga, which is where my mum lives. We could have gone via Hamilton, but instead we went through Paeroa for reasons that we will come to shortly. One of the reasons on the way is it's really beautiful just along this drive, and here we are looking out towards the Coromandel, which is on the east coast of the North Island. We'd stopped for a short break by this river. I'm pretty sure it's the Ruapehu River, and it was just so lovely. And all credits to Nick for capturing this drone footage. It's amazing. As much as I could have stayed here for a long time, it was time to move on to the small town of Paeroa, home of the giant L&P bottle. Nick and I always have to visit the big things that are around Australia and New Zealand, and of course take selfies. As far as I know, L&P is pretty much only in New Zealand. Next stop was Tauranga, which also has a really pretty harbour, and is New Zealand's largest port, just ahead of Auckland. But pretty scenery aside, the main reason for visiting Tauranga is so I could see my mother. It had been 3.5 years, no thanks to the pandemic, and we finally managed to reunite. This time wasn't a long visit, but it was a really lovely one, and I was so happy to spend the next few days with my mum and stepfather. It was definitely a quality visit, and it more than made up for all of the stupid paperwork we had to fill out in order to go overseas. I'd forgotten about it by then. So Mum took us to one of her favourite places, McLaren Falls Park. Nick and I had decided to not do the Hobbiton tour this time around. We've done it before, it's not far from where Mum lives, and it's very expensive. But it turns out we didn't need to because this whole area looks exactly like the Shire as well. So if you're a fan of The Lord of the Rings, this area is quite similar to where they filmed the Shire. And you can see it's very reminiscent of it, with those beautiful rolling green hills. The weather was truly spectacular, and the autumn foliage was just magnificent. What a beautiful place this is. And I took so many photos, so much art inspiration in just this one area. It was a really pleasant walk as well around the lake. On the other side, the lighting was spectacular with the sun dappling through the leaves. Lots of bird life as well, even black swans with their babies, unusual for this time of year. I even managed to do another little painting in my sketchbook, and Nick took this sneaky video that I didn't even realise he was doing. I was so absorbed in my own painting. It was an amazing view from the cafe area though. Here are some of my favourite photos from this beautiful part of Middle-earth. Gotta have one selfie. And while the weather was good, we drove down to Papamoa Beach right on the coast. That's Mount Maunganui just disappearing off the screen now. And what a gorgeous beach it is. It just stretches for miles and there were barely any people, so it's just a beautiful part of the country. I mean, really, this is what all of New Zealand's coastline looks like, at least on the east side. On the western side, it's much rougher and you'll get much larger waves. Hi, Mum! I, of course, wandered too far down the beach and inevitably copped a drenching on the cuffs of my trousers. I always underestimate how far water will go, and that wave just kept on coming, so I had to back up hastily, but clearly not quickly enough when you see how much of my capris are drenched there. Lovely! Nick also captured some pretty sweet drone footage. Along the coast here there were no issues, but further in town was a problem because Tauranga Airport is right in the middle of the city and that's a no-fly zone for drones. But along the coastline it's open, and what a spectacular view it was. Just outside the no-fly zone is Mount Maunganui, the touristy part, which is very much a holiday destination. And I've stayed here in the past in the caravan park with my father many years ago when I was a teenager. I was in that water for hours and I got so sunburned. It's a good place for a holiday though, and you can climb up the top of the mountain, I think. There is also a walking track around the circumference of it, which I've done as well. And here's the caravan park coming into view just at the base of the volcano. It is a dormant volcano. Here's hoping it stays that way. It's a lovely place to stay though. I highly recommend it. Turning around, that's Tauranga on the far side of the harbour, and then closer in is Mount Maunganui and Papamoa Beach stretching all the way down there. What a place to live, eh? Eventually we had to part ways with my folks, and on to our next leg of the trip, all the way down to Wellington via Taupo. You can't miss it, there's a big sign. Lake Taupo is the largest in New Zealand. It's actually a massive caldera, would you believe, so that is quite an active volcano under the water. Across the lake, shrouded in clouds, are 3 mountains, and unfortunately we couldn't see them heading down to Wellington because there was just too much low cloud, and it was pretty cold by now. But don't forget about those mountains. Driving further around the lake, we stopped here for lunch. What a beautiful view. Another big thing to collect, the big gumboot in Taihape. And I am pretty sure this is the wettest place in New Zealand, so I'm sure gumboots are mandatory footwear. Selfie time! Eventually we made it down to Wellington, or Wellywood, and once again we were blessed with extraordinary weather. Quite often Wellington is extremely windy, as shown here by the sign, but the mild weather afforded us some lovely views of the city. It's a very hilly place, so there are quite a few lookouts to check out the vista. Wellington Airport is right in the middle of town, so there was no way we could get any drone footage, unfortunately, but I do quite like this photo I took. Definitely no drones allowed with that flight path. We drove around to the very southern coast, and looking out here is the South Island somewhere there. Can you see it? Just vaguely underneath the clouds. So this is the Cook Strait that separates the two islands, and there are regular inter-island ferries which you can put your car on and go across. It was nice and calm today, but I know from previous experience that it can be rough as guts, and I was quite seasick on the time that we caught the ferry across. But on April 10th, 1968, was one of the worst disasters ever in New Zealand, which happened right here, and that was the ferry Wahine, which had come across during Wellington's worst storm ever, and it was pushed into Barrett's Reef, where the rocks ripped the hull open and the entire ship just foundered over onto its side. Everyone was evacuated, but very sadly 51 people lost their lives. And even now in Wellington, they have a memorial every year on April the 10th. My mum lived in Wellington at the time as a young woman, and she remembers it all vividly. She was telling me about it, and it was such a tragedy. It's really sad looking at these old photos. But it is with morbid fascination that I must go and see these places. I think that's Barrett's Reef just out in the water there, those rocks. A bit further around the coast we found an actual memorial for the Wahine, with one of its anchors actually laid out so it's pointing to the ship's final resting place out by that rock in the water. It was quite sad being there really, but at the same time I was glad to have seen it for myself because it just makes it a lot more real and that it actually happened. And it's really great that Wellington has posted so much history about it because it is a very important event, a very tragic one, up there with the Titanic really. So it was with a feeling of melancholy that I looked out upon this absolutely beautiful view. When the weather is good like it was this day, Wellington is such a gorgeous harbour city. And of course, no drones here either because we were still in the flight path, but I was just happy the weather was good. I'd only been to Wellington a couple of times as a young teenager and I didn't really remember a lot of it, and now as someone who isn't a teenager anymore, I could really appreciate its beauty and the ruggedness of those rocks. Could you imagine living here with that amazing view? Although it's probably not quite as nice when the wind is howling and the rain is sideways, but it would be idyllic on a day like this. And here are a few photos I took. Back in the city, no trip to Wellington is complete without riding the Wellington Cable Car at least once. An iconic, picturesque view if ever there was one. Of course we had a ride on it. Very much like a Melbourne tram, actually. Only a lot hillier. And of course these days you can never quite get past COVID. The stupid face mask sign. Ugh, what a drag. Wellington is the capital city of New Zealand, and therefore it is mandatory to see the Parliament Houses. That is the beehive on the right-hand side. Called that because, funnily enough, it's shaped like a beehive. Jacinda wasn't in that day because she was isolating at home, would you believe? But I got a couple of snaps. I may have also found an art shop. We even found this fountain which had been on the news a few days prior because the lowest yellow scoop had been stolen and finally returned. Hooray! But here's the main reason we came to Wellington, the Weta workshop, where they made all of the props for the Lord of the Rings movies and the Hobbit movies, also a whole bunch of other movies like Krampus, Thunderbirds, King Kong, there's so many of them. But you know we were here for Middle-earth. This had been on my bucket list for many years and I am so happy we finally made it to the Weta workshop and Weta cave. There's even a troll out the front and a hobbit door, but the main entrance is actually over here through this less than exciting door. And up above is the Weta cave sign. So the Weta cave is where all the merch is sold. Replicas and souvenirs. But they also had a lot of stuff on display, actual props and models, things from the movies. It was really interesting. Apologies for my terrible footage, it was so dark in here, I couldn't really get a lot. But you could see quite a lot of the armour that was used in the Lord of the Rings movies, a head of King Kong there, some hobbit feet, and all sorts of other weird and wonderful things. And best of all, this part is free because it's in the shop, unless of course you buy stuff, which we may have done. But I was really impressed with how much they had on display, and we were allowed to film in here, so that was really nice. There was no filming allowed on the actual Weta workshop tour, which we paid to do as well because, of course. But here's the sword that was broken. That was so exciting, and that was in the shop, so I was really happy to see it. If you ever make it to New Zealand, the Weta workshop experience is highly recommended. I loved it. It was a highlight of our trip, and we had the best time. There was, of course, plenty of stuff to buy, some of it costing thousands of dollars. And we may have spent a little bit in the shop, but hey, we're there once, so why not? The statues were my favourite though, especially this one of Gollum. And Gandalf. He was on the actual tour and one of the few areas where we were allowed to take photos. Here's Azog as well. He's right behind me, isn't he? And easily my favourite photo of the entire trip. So this was a great time, and I am so happy to have ticked it off my bucket list. One other place of note that we visited was Te Papa Museum, which had this incredible exhibition of Gallipoli from the First World War, and which is commemorated every Anzac Day in Australia and New Zealand. And Weta Workshop was involved with making these incredibly large, lifelike statues that were displayed throughout the exhibition. It was amazing. I'm so glad we got to see this, and it was free. Well worth a visit. And last up, we found the Wellington Museum, which had a whole wing dedicated to the Wahine disaster, and this just kind of rounded out the whole visit to Wellington for us. Because it is much easier and cheaper to fly out of Auckland, we drove all the way back. But it was totally worth it, because remember those mountains I'd mentioned earlier? To begin with, they were enshrouded in clouds, as they so often are. But as we drove along, the clouds started to lift, and slowly they emerged. Firstly, there is Mount Ruapehu, the largest of the three, and this had actually been threatening to erupt all week. It is very much an active volcano, and during the 90s it erupted and a huge plume of ash actually shut down Auckland Airport for quite a few days. But thankfully Ruapehu behaved itself and treated us to a stunning view. The cloud bank beside it is still covering the other two mountains. But as we watched, those started to come out as well. As I pan around, coming into view now, or partly into view, is the conical Mount Narahoi, and beside it the smaller Mount Tongariro. Now, if you're a Lord of the Rings fan, Mount Narahoi is better known as Mount Doom in the land of Mordor where the shadows lie, where Gollum fell into the fiery depths and destroyed the ring. I still can't believe we got to see them. I have climbed up all three mountains during my teenage years, at least partly up them, and there really aren't any words to describe the joy I felt seeing these beloved mountains once more. We could see them a bit better across Lake Taupo this time, although the clouds were already starting to come back. On our way back to Auckland, we stopped at the Big Sheep and Sheepdog. I think this was pretty much the last blue sky we saw. Then for the rest of our time in Auckland, it was pretty much like this, but that's okay. We'd done just about everything we wanted to do, so weather wasn't really an issue anymore. I guess we're not going up the Sky Tower, much too wet, and we didn't really fancy paying to look at a view of clouds. I don't much like heights anyway, and it's a long way up. I've been there before. But would you believe it, directly opposite the Sky Tower is a second Weta workshop. We only found out about it on this trip, and I think it's brand new. We didn't do the experience here, but we did go into the Weta cave, and that shop was just as good, especially the 3 trolls out the front, and the gigantic statue of Smorg that was built inside the shop. Almost $5,000 Thranduil statue, anyone? I don't think it would have fitted into my suitcase somehow. But overall, we had an amazing trip. I got to see some family members, and my mum even came up to Auckland, so we spent one last day with her. That was awesome. And then it was time to go home to these poor guys who were dying to come home from the cattery. We were all exhausted and glad to get home. Thank you all so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed watching this video. I'll be getting back to some art in my next one. Until then, hug your loved ones, and I'll swatch you later. Bye!